All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining me for our App Security and Risk Findings report on Latin and South America. So my name is Scott King at Zimperium, and I'm joined by my colleague, Kern Smith. We're going to talk a little bit about what we found. And Kern, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Scott. Glad to be here.
All right,
Looking forward
good,
to the
good.
conversation.
I know we've got a lot of good detail that we're going to provide everyone. If obviously we're recording this, you did get the warning. It's a new privacy warning. So if you'd like to come back and listen to this or forward it to your colleagues, you are more than welcome to do so. And most of you have already had the slides to follow along, and hopefully you have some good questions. If you do have some questions as we go along today, just type them into the Q&A window and we'll get to them either one as needed or at the end of the session. We will clean it up and make sure that everyone's questions are being answered. And then our email addresses are available as well if you want to send us a private question that you may think of later. But essentially what we're going to talk about is high-level research that we've conducted of over 1,000 different apps, 280 of those in the Latin and South American regions. So these are only finance apps. So what that means when you go to the Play Store or the App Store, these are your mobile banking apps, cryptocurrency, peer-to-peer payment, anything where money is transacting. So we want to make sure in level set there. If you want to understand if your app is in the data set, just contact us later and we'll kind of walk you through the details. But at a high level, what we're going to talk about today is some of the findings in the apps. Why are they more secure or less private than another? We're going to talk about obfuscation, fraud, compliance in terms of OWASP mobile top 10 checks, and then answer your questions. So Kern, any high level thoughts before we get started?
Yeah, no, I think one of the common things that we're seeing in these reports is unintended consequences, if you will, right? And what I mean by that is either vulnerabilities or risk being introduced to apps, basically unintentionally through either third-party SDKs or a developer trying to achieve a functionality that is a byproduct of that introduced other unforeseen consequences, if you will. And that seems to be a common thread as we look through a lot of these things. So it's not necessarily that there was intentional issues going on with these things, but more gaining visibility on things really drew out a lot of kind of the unintended consequences of what were otherwise relatively benign or activities that were done with good intentions, if you will, by the developers.
Yeah, and I mean the unintended consequence, it's a good way to look at it because a lot of times you just don't have the full context of what's going on, especially in the apps that are developed by distributed teams or multiple regions when you have different country laws and things like that. But really what we want to do is we want to eliminate fraud from the system. So the average value of a fraudulent transaction, you can see here across the different regions, varies anywhere from $218 to $364. So South America and Latin America would be lumped into the Americas, which is a lower number, which is good, but still you want to rid that, right, from your system. And the criminals know how to do this, right? So they subscribe to the different data sources. They're creating malware. These are some of the recent campaigns that were really focused on the finance apps, the mobile banking apps. This is your bank bot, and most recently BlackRock. So, Kern, are you having conversations with customers about this? How to rid this? How to detect
Yeah,
this?
yeah.
And then what really worries them from a criminal or cybercrime standpoint?
Yeah, I think it's just the constant question of how do you keep up with it, right? And we've seen this, time and time again. Malicious actors are coming up with new and inventive ways of, targeting mobile assets, right? And part of it is what is old is new again, right? So if you look at Cerberus and BlackRock and Anubis, they kind of all have a similar family tree, if you will, and are trying to achieve the same objectives. But these attackers are smart, and they're finding ways to bypass what we used to think as in vault controls. I mean, you look at some of the Jekyll and Hyde stuff, even hitting malware going into the Apple App Store as an example, where attackers are getting more and more inventive of bypassing some of the controls that have put into place. So really keeping up with the evolving ecosystem has been really critical for most of our customers. And I think importantly, keeping up with it without impacting the software development lifecycle or the ability to get to market. So, every time a new threat comes up, making sure that you don't have to update or push out a new version of the app, because that has material business impact as well with all the processes that come out around release. So it's really just, how do I keep up, and how do I keep up in a manner that is not impacting my go-to-market or my normal day-to-day business operations?
Yeah, I think it's important to realize that, whitelisting and blacklisting is just futile. You can't keep up with it, especially in mobile. So this is from a RSA quarterly fraud report from earlier this year, and they stated 3 out of every 4 transactions, or nearly, right, 72%, are actually via the mobile channel. And what makes it important is because a successful mobile fraud is 3 times as valuable as the other numbers that we looked at. Earlier, it was $218 for a fraudulent transaction. And current, this one, a fraudulent mobile transaction is really pretty valuable.
Yeah, I mean, especially when you look at other fraudulent transactions being, maybe, we'll be generous and say, half of the value, right? Based on attempts, the return on investment for an attacker on mobile is just invaluable. And we're seeing it more and more where mobile is becoming the first point of entry, or one of the primary initial targets for attackers to either directly compromise a enterprise system or gain valuable intelligence about what the back end or any type of vulnerabilities that could exist in there. Because, unlike, say, web applications where you kind of control who accesses it and you can monitor those systems, with mobile apps, they're being put out into the wild and people install those apps onto their devices. So it's just a vastly different threat landscape, and really the type of monitoring and security that you put around something that actually gets installed on devices and you have no direct control over after the fact becomes vastly different than, say, other approaches with web-based applications and things of that nature.
Yeah, and just with the global pandemic, I mean, we're spending more time outside of offices and banks, and I mean, it's all mobile, it's all remote, so you got to protect yourself, right? So you
Absolutely
have to understand the threat and how it actually migrates. So even if the criminals and cybercrime isn't evolving, our usage and our habits are evolving. So this is a set of a data set from 3,000 different Android mobile finance apps. These are what this graph represents is whether or not you are actually using obfuscation and shielding in your app or not. So current at the top, on an average, 56% of finance apps don't use any obfuscation at all. And then the light green is just open source obfuscation. So this is available to anyone. So maybe it's not like obfuscating at all, right? And then, if you're using a specialty security solution, if you're really on top of your security game, that's only 8% of total apps across all these regions.
Yeah, and I think it comes down to, again, visibility and, just understanding where the risk vectors are. I mean, when you look at how do I secure applications, or really secure anything, step one is, how do I make it harder for somebody to read what I'm putting out there? That's one of the initial steps, along with reducing the threat surface and active defense. So, I think what this kind of tells is that there are while there's awareness in the market of the need of putting in security in there, it's really showing kind of where the level of maturity is at for these systems. My apologies, my headset just gave out there. Now, while you know, admittedly, it may not account for security that may be done on the back end and those types of things. I think it definitely opens up a conversation around, okay, what is the level of investment and what is the true level of security that we have in these assets that are actively being put out into the wild, where we have limited control over once they get out there, and how, what is the actual data that is in those apps that could be detrimental if an attacker was actually able to, you know, reverse it and start looking at things.
Yeah, we'll definitely point out some of those points later in the research, Kern, especially about what is in your app that you are exposing to everyone. But, you know, lack of obfuscation, there are successful breaches and attacks because, you know, the app, the mobile app wasn't, you know, correctly obfuscated. It wasn't correctly hardened because, you know, even though the mobile app may not be, you know, the primary form of attack, it is a good source of information. The Tesco Bank example is a really good one where the mobile, you know, the attack wasn't through the mobile app, but the mobile app surrendered all the credentials and the API information for the criminals to go, you know, from a different direction.
No, totally. I mean, I couldn't have said it better myself.
Oh, well, that's good. So a little bit about what we did. So this is just an explanation of how many apps that we looked at. There were 114 iOS and 174 Android apps across these regions. And let's get into what we found. So at a high level, we do score these from a compliance standpoint for the OWASP Mobile Top 10. And the high level numbers, most of these apps actually fail some of these checks, right? Insecure data storage, communication, you know, reverse engineering is always a big one that people ask us about. And then the code tampering, the Android one on code tampering, which is M8 on our charts, is actually a little bit better for Android. So I'm going to just give you a high level look at what this is. So this OWASP Mobile Top 10 for iOS apps, if it's red, this is the percentage of apps that actually failed this check. So you can see that M2, M3, 8, and 9, the high percentage of apps actually fail those checks. On Android, it looks a little bit different. There are actually some that actually pass for reverse engineering. And that's interesting because most people understand that they are doing some obfuscation and they are doing some hardening, but, you know, outside of your purview, where, you know, there may be some other unintended consequence, like you talked about earlier, Kern, you know, some other team may not be properly doing it, which would cause you to fail.
Mm-hmm.
So before we get into this, what we did is we plotted all of the different apps per operating system in this quadrant. So if you're in the lower left, you need significant improvement to move up to the upper right-hand corner. So the upper right-hand corner would be your leading applications. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about some of the findings that would force you to move down in terms of in terms of the distribution on maybe some areas that you need to work on in your app. So Kern, here's some critical security findings just for this region. So when you look at all the charts, this region is going to be green. So just follow along the green colors,
Mm-hmm.
and we'll make sure and you know, give you a comparison across the different regions. So Kern, here, username and password exposed in URLs. There's some data file protection classes set to none. And then, you know, interesting here on the bottom two numbers, the vulnerable versions of these libraries and over the app air installation, the South America apps are actually 0.
Yeah, no, it's, I mean, I think it's a credit to the folks out there on those steps, you know, but the things that stand out to me, and again, it comes back down to that awareness aspect is, you know, the username, password in the URL and the SQL injection items. The reason those stand out to me is that, you know, from password exposure in a URL, I mean, this is something that uh, it depends on what system that's connecting to. Is it a third-party system or internal? But we see this really commonly across, you know, you see it across the board. But this is something that kind of typically is a leftover of a development cycle, and just somebody forgot to scrub it out, if you will, because they hard-coded creds. And unfortunately, we've seen that time and time again get weaponized for further breaches down the line. And then you look at kind of the remote SQL injection. I mean, this is just kind of the classic, all right, how do I find the soft underbelly of something and start hammering away at that? That's something that definitely stands out to me. And again, part of this is law of unintended consequences. How do I get something out there to the world to do a business function? But it goes back into even if the percentages are low, it can sometimes be devastating when and if it happens to a specific organization's app. So it again comes back down to visibility in these instances.
Yeah, you really want to make sure that you understand the risk, because there could be a good reason for it. And then you have another system that may be helping you alleviate that risk, but you really just need to be aware.
Mm-hmm.
So here are some privacy and leakage findings in the iOS apps in this set. You know, the location, normally Apple says this is only allowed for navigation apps. It does make sense for a banking app because maybe I'm looking for ATM or a branch or you know, some type of service that actually has a physical address. But you know, again, when we looked earlier at the passwords, we're still sending some query parameters containing private information through here. And then at the bottom, what I find interesting, Kern, is the iOS Health Kit. Some of these apps actually are looking at your steps or your heart rate, or
Mm-hmm.
you know, what other permissions the health app has. So that I found that quite interesting.
No, definitely. I mean, I just as a user, I kind of go, okay, what's the functionality that was enabled that needed this permission, right? And again, it goes back to, you know, why is this enabled? Because you know, technology, it's you enable one thing, and it has a cascade of effects. So you know, what was actually put out there. You know, again, it comes back down to these are kind of common things across the board that we're seeing that are pretty ubiquitous, you know, from region to region, some regions with certain, you know, areas that are more, that come up more and more. But it comes back down to visibility, right? Because as we've seen with the regulatory environments that we all exist in, you know, it kind of doesn't matter if you're talking about GDPR, California Private Secure laws, the Hong Kong Monetary Authority laws that are out there. It's a trend that is ever increasing. So I think hygiene in these areas, or this type of visibility, is going to become more and more useful, not just from a security controls perspective, but also just from a general regulatory and brand protection perspective as well.
Yeah, true. Yeah, you definitely want to pay attention to that. So moving on to Android, this chart looks a little bit different. Obviously, the apps are plotted per operating system because obviously they have different functions, and the operating systems, you know, they operate independently, obviously. But, you know, again, there's a high number of apps on the left side of this chart that actually need improvement from a security perspective. So from a privacy risk perspective, at a high level, I find that these Android apps actually score better for privacy. So let's look in to see why that may be. So again, follow along on our green charts, and this one gets a little busy because there are a lot of findings that we've provided on this chart. You know, using the WebKit to download a file from the internet, we did find that this is pretty common. with hybrid application platforms and things like that. Um, what I like on this is the functionality to install additional apps. In South America, it's actually 0, but on the bottom, again, Kern, the app can perform a trace route network function. The South America app scored the highest for this. Any thoughts on why that may be?
Again, I think it boils back down to functionality. It may be some creative ways of doing location tracking, things of that nature. I mean, it kind of gets into an app by app specific item, but it is curious that South America has such a prevalence of it relative to other regions. I almost wonder if there was a developer forum that was out there that that may have said, "Hey, here's a cool thing, go for it." But again, it's being able to identify why is this in there, right? Why are we tracking this? Is this best practice? For example, we see apps that can retrieve additional code, right? And that kind of makes sense in certain regions because you want to keep the initial size of the app file down when to a low point when people are downloading it. But again, this is all about trying to understand, okay, where are the potential risk in here? And is the functionality that I'm trying to enable worth the risk that may or may not be introduced into the application? Because again, it is kind of law of unintended consequences with a couple of these things.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah, you just need to make sure, like, again, we're just using this, the high level data. And obviously if if you own a finance app in South America, you definitely want to contact us and make sure that, that you understand all that you can understand from your app. But here again, like some of the ones that pop up to me for data leakage, Kern, the phone call log, which is interesting. The app is reading complete address book. Again, a lot of functions, if I need to do a peer-to-peer payment, obviously you need access to the address book. The screenshots it can be abused. We've seen a lot of these capabilities are the developer will actually put some testing software in there to actually, let them either test applications remotely or, look at what users are doing, how they use the app. We have seen that leak before, but the beacon, finance apps using beacons to communicate with each other. I find that interesting on this chart too. Anything that pops out here, Kern, for you?
Yeah, I mean, I think you hit the highlights on it. From a pure security perspective, the other ones that stand out to me are anything that contains user or password information, either kind of in the clear with, API gets and credentials that may be hard coded in there. Again, goes back to just general hygiene and, were things kind of left over from the dev cycle that may or maybe not, maybe should not have been released to the public. So just, again, visibility.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's actually surprising how many credentials that we find that are being passed back and forth in plain text or hard coded. So you definitely want to take a look at that. So some of the lower level, so we have critical and dangerous. Dangerous is less than critical. So there'd be a lot more of these. But again, it's the recording of video, it's accesses to inbox, it's social media sharing. Again, these are finance apps. So I don't really share anything from my finance apps personally. So it would be interesting to see what type of functionality resides in some of these apps. Maybe, Kern, if you were a cryptocurrency app and you were, social posting current rates or conversions or anything like that, that may be shareable, but I don't really want to share anything from my finance app.
Well, absolutely. And if it's asking for those items, I kind of want to know what the underlying functionality is that it's trying to enable, right? So that as a user, as a developer, as a business stakeholder, I can understand what the risk and reward is on this, both technically and also from a security standpoint, but also from a brand standpoint as well, right? Is this functionality basically the saying and is the juice worth the squeeze, more or less? Is this functionality, does it make sense to roll out this functionality versus the risk that it may introduce to the organization?
Yeah. And these do have access to clipboard and some other items. You know, the microphone, I noticed that North America is actually not on that chart for having access to the device microphone. That is interesting. So some of the other regions may be using some authentication methods on the microphone, which kind of defeats the purpose of a second factor, right? If I'm using the microphone to speak into, like, I am who I really am, it's still, if you've compromised the device, you know, all of that, it doesn't matter. So rounding out, you know, some of our best practices and recommendations, Kern, how are you advising customers on, you know, where they are in the life cycle maybe, or what common questions that you get from application development teams?
Well, I think the challenge that most customers I've spoken to have faced is, okay, where do I start and how do I deal with kind of all the different solutions out there? Because one of the trends that we see, and this is kind of across the board, is, you know, look, everybody has these different toolings, but what they really need is a platform for consolidation so that as you look at the overall software development lifecycle, it is kind of a seamless integration so that you ultimately can save time getting to market to release out new versions, right? Because typically there have been unnatural gates put in for review processes, et cetera, right before an app goes live, and now you're getting into conflicts between the technical security requirements and the business requirements. So, and having that platform that kind of addresses the overall SDLC of the app with identifying and remediating risk, be it privacy, security, regulatory, during the build of the application, right? So scanning it so that that becomes a natural workflow during the entire development cycle, so you don't have arbitrary gates put into it. And then putting security into the app, both from a static standpoint with hardening, shielding, obfuscation, et cetera, but also dynamic security controls to keep up with that ever-changing threat landscape, so the app can actively self-defend itself at runtime if somebody is trying to tamper with all of those hardening elements, and then ultimately using that runtime defense to generate a true picture of what's going on with these apps to use as the true perimeter, or the true sensor on the perimeter for most organizations to understand, is somebody trying to profile us, is somebody trying to attack us, et cetera, because really these mobile assets are the true parameter nowadays for most organizations from an IT perspective.
Yeah, definitely is. You know, the perimeter has changed quite a bit, in you know, all the different exposure points, and especially since, you know, if I'm an app developer, I don't own the endpoint, right? I own an access point. So I really need to make sure that you understand the health of all those third-party devices that are essentially connecting to your bank's back end. So if you do have some questions, we'll hang on for a minute or two as you type them in. Maybe you have questions about the data in the report. If you would like a risk assessment for your app, please contact us. You can go to our website, it's imperium.com, and hit the contact us button, and then just type in the comments, hey, I was on the webinar and I'd like to take Scott and Kern up on their offer. And if you would like a custom briefing for your team, we can take your app and we can formulate a briefing just for you. So therefore we can really provide more detail, since we can't divulge private details in a public webinar. So Kern, any closing thoughts before we shut down for the day?
No, I just think, you know, like we've said, like we've been kind of saying over and over again, a lot of it comes down as to driving visibility, and then, you know, having tooling or a platform in place so that this just becomes a seamless part of the SDLC of an app and really becomes a unified approach from both a technological perspective, but also a business perspective as well to reduce those risk and threat postures.
Well, Kern, thanks for joining me. I really appreciate your time. And for all of you watching out there in Latin and South America, I really appreciate your time that you invested with us today. And please let us know how we can help you. And thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.